The vastness of space had always called to Captain Elias Carter, but he never imagined that answering that call would change his life forever. He was a man of discipline, a veteran of the Earth Space Corps, charting unknown territories, pushing the boundaries of human exploration. But fate, unpredictable and relentless, had something different in store for him. His ship, the Dauntless, was en route to an uncharted sector when a distress signal pierced the silence of deep space. Faint and garbled, it carried a sense of desperation that sent a shiver down his spine. The transmission was weak, almost lost in the cosmic static, but one thing was clear: it was a cry for help. Against protocol and the protests of his crew, Elias made the decision. He couldn't leave someone to die in the void. As the Dauntless followed the signal, they found the wreckage of an unfamiliar vessel drifting near a dying star. The ship was heavily damaged, its hull torn open by what looked like an energy blast. No known faction bore such technology. The crew prepared for what could be an ambush, but Elias had a feeling, an instinct buried deep in his gut, that told him this was something different. With his heart pounding, he led the rescue team onto the ruined ship. Inside, the air was thin, lights flickering in and out of existence, casting eerie shadows along the corridor. Then, they found her. She was unlike anything Elias had ever seen. Her form was humanoid, but her skin shimmered faintly, reflecting the dim emergency lights. Her silver hair floated weightlessly in the dying gravity, and her eyes, deep, luminous pools of violet, locked onto his with a mixture of relief and fear. She was injured, pinned beneath a fallen support beam, and barely conscious. Elias acted fast, ignoring the warning signs that the ship was moments away from total collapse. As his team worked to lift the debris, the woman's gaze met his again. She tried to speak, her voice weak and melodic, but he couldn't understand. There was no time to figure it out. He reached down, scooping her into his arms, and ran as the walls trembled around them. Just as they made it back aboard the Dauntless, the alien vessel gave its final death rattle, breaking apart and vanishing into the abyss. The crew sealed the airlock, and Elias carried her to the med bay, his mind racing with questions. Who was she? What had happened to her ship? It took days before she was strong enough to communicate properly. Their technology managed to translate bits and pieces of her language, and he learned her name, Liara. She was not just any traveler. She was a warrior, a protector of her people, and the last survivor of an ambush by an enemy known only as the Varkash. They had been hunting her across the stars. At first, Liara was cautious, mistrustful even. She had never met a human before. Her people knew of Earth's existence, but had kept their distance. She had been told humans were unpredictable, dangerous. Yet Elias had risked his life to save hers without hesitation. It unsettled her more than she cared to admit. Days turned into weeks as she recovered aboard the Dauntless. Elias and Liara spent more time together, slowly breaking the barriers of language and culture. She was fascinated by human resilience, their ability to adapt, to survive. And Elias? He found himself drawn to her strength, her unyielding will to fight for what she believed in. But peace was fleeting. The Varkash had tracked them. One fateful night, the alarm blared through the ship. 3 Varkash warships had dropped out of hyperspace, their weapons primed. They had come for Liara. Elias knew they had no chance in a direct fight. The Dauntless was a research vessel, not a battleship. But surrender was not an option. He refused to let them take her. He refused to let them win. Elias, Liara stood beside him on the bridge, her violet eyes burning with resolve. You don't have to do this. Yes, I do, he said without hesitation. I don't leave people behind. What followed was the most harrowing battle of Elias's life. With Liara's knowledge of Varkash tactics and Elias's instinct for combat, they fought like a single unit. They outmaneuvered the enemy, used the asteroid field to their advantage, and struck when the Varkash least expected. By the time the dust settled, the Dauntless was barely holding together, but the Varkash were gone. Defeated. As they drifted in the silence of victory, Elias turned to Liara. What now? He asked, the weight of everything they had survived pressing upon him. Liara hesitated, then stepped closer. I was always meant to protect my people. But now I think my path has changed. Elias knew what she meant. He felt it too. Beyond the stars, beyond duty and war, fate had brought them together. And now, standing in the wreckage of their old lives, they had the chance to build something new. Together, the silence that followed was not empty. It was filled with the unspoken understanding between them. Liara had lived a life of duty, of war and sacrifice, and Elias had spent his years in disciplined service to humanity's expansion into the stars. But now, for the first time, they were both faced with the unknown, a future neither had planned for, yet one neither wanted to turn away from. The Dauntless was barely operational. Damage reports flooded in as the crew worked tirelessly to stabilize life support and propulsion. They were stranded in the outer reaches of the sector, with no immediate backup, and hyperspace travel was out of the question until repairs were made. Elias turned to Liara, who stood beside him on the dimly lit bridge. She had been watching him closely ever since the battle ended, her keen warrior's instincts still on edge. "You saved my life," she finally said, her voice softer than he had ever heard it. He gave a tired smile. "You saved mine too." She shook her head. "You didn't have to fight for me. You could have handed me over. It would have been easier." Elias exhaled, glancing out the viewport at the vast emptiness beyond. "Maybe, but I don't take the easy way out. And I don't abandon people." Liara studied him, and for the first time since he had found her in that wreckage, something in her gaze softened. The hard edges of her warrior's demeanor eased, if only slightly. The repairs took days. Every waking moment was spent fixing systems, sealing breaches, and ensuring they could make it to the nearest friendly station. But during those long hours, something began to shift between Elias and Liara. She spent more time with him, asking questions about Earth, about humanity's history and culture. She wanted to understand why humans fought the way they did, why they cared so fiercely, why they risked everything for people they barely knew. Elias, in turn, learned more about her world. The way her people viewed honor, the way they had lived under the constant shadow of the Varkesh threat. She had lost so much, friends, comrades, even family. And yet, she had survived. One evening, as they worked side by side repairing a power conduit in engineering, Elias caught her staring at him. "What?" he asked with a smirk. She hesitated. "I was wrong about humans." "Oh." He leaned against the console. "And what did you think before? That your kind was reckless, impulsive, that you fought without purpose, that you sought out conflict without reason." She tilted her head. "But now I see you fight because you care, because you refuse to accept injustice, even if it means risking everything." Elias met her gaze, something stirring deep within him. "And what do you think now?" She took a step closer. "I think I was right about one thing." He raised an eyebrow. "What's that?" A faint smile touched her lips. "Humans are dangerous." Before he could respond, the ship shuddered. The alarm blared to life again, sending them both into high alert. Elias rushed to the bridge, Liara close behind. The remaining crew had already scrambled to their stations, eyes fixed on the scanner readings. "What is it?" Elias demanded. One of his officers turned, his face pale. "Sir, it's not the Varkesh." The screen flickered, showing an incoming vessel, sleek, dark, and unlike anything Elias had seen before. It was massive, larger than any known warship in the galaxy. It didn't match any known faction. Liara's breath hitched. "No, it can't be." Elias glanced at her. "What?" Her violet eyes were wide with something he had never seen in her before, fear. "They're not Varkesh," she whispered. "They're worse." The comms crackled, and a deep, inhuman voice filled the bridge. "Unknown vessel, you are harboring a fugitive. Surrender the warrior Liara, or be annihilated." Elias felt his pulse quicken, but he stood firm. He glanced at Liara, at the silent war raging in her expression. He knew one thing for certain. He wasn't giving her up. With a slow exhale, he turned to his crew. "Shields up," he ordered. "We're not surrendering anyone." Liara looked at him, something unreadable in her gaze. Elias tightened his grip on the console. Whatever was coming next, they would face it together. The bridge fell into a tense silence. The enemy vessel loomed closer, its dark hull reflecting the distant stars like a void that threatened to consume them whole. The voice on the comms had been clear: "Surrender Liara, or die." Elias's crew exchanged uncertain glances. They were battered, their ship barely holding together, and their weapons were no match for a ship of that size. Logically, there was no chance of survival. But logic had never dictated Elias's choices. He turned to Liara. "Who are they?" She hesitated, her fingers curling into fists. They are the Zelari. The name alone carried weight, spoken with the same dread as a death sentence. They were believed to be a myth, a race that exists outside the reach of any empire. They do not conquer for resources or power. They collect specimens. Elias frowned. Specimens. They take the strongest, the smartest, the most unique individuals from every species they encounter. Her voice was quiet, almost haunted, and those who are taken are never seen again. A cold chill crept down Elias's spine. He turned back to the comms, knowing the Zelari were waiting for his response. His crew was watching him. They were exhausted, injured, desperate for a way out. The logical choice was to give Liara up. He could even convince himself it wasn't betrayal. She wasn't human. She wasn't his responsibility. And yet, he looked at her, at the hardened warrior who had fought beside him, who had trusted him when she had no reason to. He remembered the way she had watched his back, the way she had begun to understand humanity, the way she had started to believe in something beyond war. No. Elias exhaled slowly. Weapon status? His weapons officer grimaced. Main cannons are down. We have emergency torpedoes, but against that ship it's like throwing rocks at a battleship. Engines. Barely functional. We can move, but we won't outrun them. Elias's mind raced. There had to be a way. He wasn't about to hand over Liara. He'd fought too hard, sacrificed too much. He wasn't going to let her be taken. A flicker of movement caught his eye. Liara had stepped closer, her expression unreadable. You don't have to do this, she said quietly. Yes, I do, Elias replied. You said humans fight because we care. Well, I care. So we fight. She searched his face, then nodded once. Then we make our stand together. Elias turned to his crew. Prepare for evasive maneuvers. Load every torpedo we have. Get me full power to the shields. We're going to do something they don't expect. The Zelari ship was nearly in firing range. The comms crackled again. Time is up, human. Surrender her. Or die. Elias grinned despite the odds. How about neither? And with that, he gave the order. The Dauntless lurched forward, its engines flaring as it spun into action. The torpedoes launched in rapid succession, not at the Zelari ship directly, but at the nearby debris field. The explosions sent massive chunks of rock and metal hurtling toward the enemy vessel. The Zelari, caught off guard, hesitated. It was the opening Elias needed. Full speed ahead, he shouted. The Dauntless shot forward, weaving through the debris field, using the chaos to mask its escape. But the Zelari weren't so easily deterred. A blast of energy roared past them, narrowly missing their hull. Another struck their rear shields, sending a violent shudder through the ship. We won't last long, his engineer warned. Shields are failing. Elias clenched his jaw. They needed a miracle. Liara suddenly stiffened, her eyes widening. There. She pointed at a swirling anomaly in space, barely visible against the stars. What is that? Elias demanded. A gravitational rift, she said quickly. A tear in space. It's unstable, but if we enter it, we might survive, Elias finished. Or we might be torn apart, his officer added. Elias laughed. Well, we're dead if we stay here anyway. He made his decision. Set course for the rift. Now. The Dauntless surged forward, engines screaming as they made for the swirling void. The Zelari fired again, but the debris cloud shielded them just enough. As they reached the edge of the rift, a final blast struck their hull, sending alarms blaring. Sparks flew. The ship groaned in protest. Elias held his breath. Come on, come on. And then, darkness. The ship was pulled in, yanked through the fabric of space itself. For a moment, everything was silent. Then, with a sudden lurch, the Dauntless re-emerged. Elias gasped, looking at the view screen. They had made it alive. But where were they? Liara exhaled, relief and exhaustion in her gaze. You did it. Elias shook his head with a grin. We did it. But their adventure was far from over. Because as they looked out into the unknown, a massive structure appeared before them. An ancient station, floating in the void, its origins unknown. And as the distress signal echoed through the ship, one thing was clear. Their journey was just beginning. The ancient station loomed before them, massive and eerily silent. Its structure was unlike anything Elias had ever seen. Vast spires of dark metal twisted toward the void, pulsating faintly with an unknown energy. It looked abandoned, yet something about it felt aware, like it was waiting for them. The distress signal echoed again through the bridge, a garbled transmission in a language no one could recognize. Liara leaned forward, her expression sharp with suspicion. "This station, I've never seen anything like it," she muttered. Elias exhaled, his grip tightening on the armrest of his chair. "Any signs of life?" His sensor officer shook her head. "Nothing conclusive. Power levels are low, but there's some kind of energy signature coming from the core. If there's anyone in there, they're either in stasis," or she hesitated, "or something else." That wasn't comforting. Elias turned to Liara. "What do you think?" She studied the station for a long moment, her violet eyes unreadable. "We don't have many options. Our ship's barely holding together. If we don't find a way to make repairs, we're dead in the water." She glanced at him. "I say we board." Elias chuckled. "I was hoping you'd say that." Minutes later, he, Liara, and a small team of armed crew members stood in the airlock, waiting for the docking sequence to complete. The Dauntless had barely managed to connect with the station's external port, its automated systems still partially functional. As the airlock hissed open, a wave of cold, stale air rushed out. Elias stepped inside first, weapon at the ready. The corridor before them was dimly lit, long and metallic, stretching into the unknown. Strange markings lined the walls, glowing faintly as if reacting to their presence. "This place feels wrong," one of his crew muttered. Elias understood the unease. There was an eerie stillness to the station, like something was waiting just beyond their vision. But they had no choice. They moved forward, sweeping the halls with their lights. Dust floated in the air, disturbed for the first time in what could have been centuries. The further they walked, the more the strange symbols pulsed with a rhythmic glow, as if guiding them deeper inside. And then, they found it. A massive chamber, lined with towering, glass-like pods. Hundreds of them, each containing a figure frozen in time. Elias stepped closer, wiping away the frost from one of the pods. His breath caught. Inside was a humanoid figure, tall, clad in dark armor, its features sharp and unfamiliar. It wasn't human. It wasn't anything he had ever seen before. Liara cursed under her breath. "Zelari." Elias's stomach dropped. "What?" She gestured around them. "These aren't just prisoners. This is a harvesting chamber. The Zelari collect the strongest warriors from every species they encounter and place them in stasis. They take their knowledge, their abilities, and use them to evolve." Elias swore, stepping back. "You mean this whole place is a—" The station shuddered. The pulsing lights along the walls brightened, flickering wildly. The distress signal changed, morphing into something new. Something alive. A low hum filled the air. Then, one by one, the pods began to open. "Elias," Liara said, her voice laced with warning. "I see it," he muttered, raising his weapon. A deep, guttural hiss echoed through the chamber. The first pod fully released its occupant, the frost dissipating as the being inside took its first breath in what could have been centuries. Its eyes snapped open, dark, unreadable, and filled with something primal. And then it moved. Fast. Elias barely had time to react before the entire station came to life around them. The being that emerged from the pod was an embodiment of nightmare. Its tall, muscular frame was covered in dark, obsidian-like armor, and its eyes, pools of endless darkness, locked onto Elias and his team. It hissed, revealing rows of razor-sharp teeth that seemed to gleam in the dim light of the station. Its movements were swift and fluid, a predatory grace that suggested it had been frozen for far too long. "Get back!" Elias barked as he instinctively pushed Liara behind him. His weapon aimed at the creature, but he knew that a single shot would not stop it, not without knowing more about its capabilities. The creature let out a guttural roar, and Elias barely had time to react as it lunged at them, moving with a speed that defied logic. His crew opened fire, but their shots seemed to have no effect on the beast. Its body was too dense, its reflexes too quick. Liara was already moving. She sprang into action, drawing a short energy blade from her side and charging at the creature with a fury Elias hadn't seen before. Her speed was unparalleled, honed from years of training and survival. She struck at the creature's side, her blade cutting through its armor, but the creature roared in pain and turned its wrath onto her. "Liara!" Elias shouted, charging forward as well. His heart pounded in his chest. He couldn't lose her. Not after everything they had been through. With a speed that matched her own, Elias brought his own weapon to bear, firing shots that made the creature stumble. But it was relentless. The creature pushed forward, slashing at Liara with its claws, sending her flying back. Elias caught her just in time, but the creature was already on top of them. In that moment of desperation, Elias realized something. The creature wasn't the true threat. It was only a part of something far bigger. The station hummed again, louder this time, the walls shaking as if something was awakening. More pods began to open. Elias's mind raced, his heart a pounding drum in his chest. This was a breeding ground, a place where the Zelari experimented and evolved their warriors. And the fight was only beginning. Liara, he yelled. We need to move. Now. She nodded, her violet eyes flickering with pain and determination. Together, they sprinted, pulling back toward the airlock. But the station was coming to life. Lights flickered, and the walls groaned as if the very structure was waking up from a long slumber. As they reached the airlock, a massive, shadowy figure emerged from the center of the chamber, a leader. Taller, more menacing, its form cloaked in dark energy. Its eyes glowed with an unnatural light, and its voice echoed through the station. Intruders, you dare challenge the Zelari? It boomed, its voice reverberating like a thunderclap. You will join our collection. Elias's blood ran cold. This was no ordinary foe. This was a being of unimaginable power, one that had been dormant for eons, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. We have to stop it, Liara said, her voice steady despite the chaos. It's the core of their evolution. Destroy it, and the rest of the Zelari will be nothing. Elias didn't hesitate. You're right. We end this now. They rushed back toward the heart of the station, weaving through the narrow corridors, evading the creatures that now stalked the halls. Elias's mind worked quickly, formulating a plan. Liara, he said, I need you to hold off that leader. I'll get to the core and shut it down. Her eyes locked onto his, a mixture of trust and understanding passing between them. No, we do this together. Together. They had been through so much. Their bond had grown stronger with each passing day, forged in battle and shared sacrifice. And now, it was time to put everything on the line. They reached the center of the station, where the glowing energy core pulsed with malevolent force. The Zelari leader stood before them, its eyes locked on Liara. Elias gripped his weapon. Now, Liara lunged, her energy blade flashing through the air as she clashed with the Zelari leader, her every move precise. Yet the leader was more powerful than anything she had faced. Its strikes were brutal, sending shockwaves through the air as their weapons collided. While Liara held the leader off, Elias moved quickly toward the core. The control panels were ancient, but the technology was familiar, enough for him to understand how to shut it down. He activated a sequence, his hands flying across the console as he inputted the codes. Come on, Elias muttered, his pulse racing. Behind him, Liara's battle raged on. The Zelari leader let out a terrifying screech, summoning the full force of its energy. It struck Liara with a brutal blast, sending her crashing into the walls. No, Elias shouted. But he couldn't look back. Not now. With one final press, the core began to destabilize. Sparks flew from the console as the energy field surrounding it flickered. The station shook violently, and Elias knew they didn't have much time. Liara, he yelled. Get out. She struggled to her feet, blood dripping from a gash on her forehead, but she was already running toward him. They had no choice. The station was collapsing. The energy core exploded in a flash of light, sending a shockwave through the entire station. The Zelari leader screamed in agony as its form shattered, disintegrating into nothingness. The remaining creatures in the station howled as they were consumed by the collapsing energy. The walls trembled, and the station began to break apart around them. Elias grabbed Liara's hand and pulled her toward the airlock. The floor beneath them cracked, and the walls started to collapse, but they made it. Barely. The Dauntless was waiting for them, the airlock already open. Elias activated the emergency thrusters, and the ship lurched forward, blasting away from the dying station just as the final explosion tore it apart. As they drifted into the cold silence of space, Elias held Liara in his arms. The battle was over. The Zelari had been defeated, the station destroyed, and they had survived. But one thing was certain. Whatever came next, they would face it together. Their journey had just begun.